The next topic that we're going to cover before we get into the final set of topics for the semester is disturbance. Now, we've talked several times about how there are both abiotic and biotic factors that affect species ecology. Okay, but we're going to concentrate specifically on what disturbance is today. Okay, and I think you've all felt disturbed. You know what it's like to be disturbed. It's not a good feeling for an organism to be disturbed. But if we define what it is, and this is a good test question because it's a definition, disturbance is a temporary change in average environmental conditions caused by physical or biotic agents that causes a pronounced change in an ecosystem. So disturbance necessarily isn't about how the organism feels. It's about their environment and how disturbed that environment is, and what happens when it is a disturbed environment. So just picture yourself now listening to this lecture. Wherever you're sitting, whether it's your living room or your library, whatever, imagine that room being picked up and you shaken violently while in that room. Obviously, you're not going to be able to perform your niche or your functions or your role in the environment because you were just massively disturbed. So we're going to investigate a few of those as this lecture goes on. Now, there are different types of disturbances, biotic and abiotic. And biotic could be being partially or fully consumed, being parasitized, any kind of environmental change caused by another organism. So if you're living on the coast and you start to get overshadowed by a plant, chances are you're not going to photosynthesize, and hence because that animal or plant is there, you're affected by them. Any kind of plant movement like whiplash, predator disturbances, or exotic species. Those are all examples of biotic disturbances. Now, abiotic disturbances are things like storm waves and currents and hurricanes and sediment and logs that get moved down rivers that crash into rocky intertidal areas, affecting the community structures on those. Ice that builds up and forms ice scour when it actually moves out, landslides, lava. So you can see it very different. So I would say another good test question would be compare and contrast biotic and abiotic disturbances. The comparison would be is that they're both disturbances and they can affect community structure and organisms. And then you can tease apart the differences between the two that are presented here on this slide. Now, an example of a biotic disturbance would be introduction of an exotic species. And I put a link there to the National Atlas about a particular mussel, a zebra mussel, that was introduced to the Great Lakes. And it's caused an awesome amount of havoc associated with Great Lake ecosystems, only because they tend to clog up pipes for water supply lines, power supply lines, effluent for power plants, and it has major effects on the ecology of the Great Lakes. And another example is the Hemigrapsis sanguineus that was introduced around 1989 and first found off the coast of Cape May, New Jersey. So if you follow your finger down on that map to where Cape May is, which is like halfway through New Jersey, you can see that the range expansion on that Hemigrapsis sanguineus is quite large. It's found all the way up to Maine now, down through most parts of North Carolina. It's an exotic species. It came from Asia, highly productive, really long breeding season, 50,000 eggs per clutch, and they usually have 3 to 4 clutches a year. It can tolerate a wide range of salinity and temperatures, eats almost everything, and it occupies a pretty similar habitat to our native species of crabs, which was, we've come to find out not recently, but had been invaded our country around 300 years ago. So these crabs are steadily increasing in number and size, and they tend to be moving up and down the coast. Now, why is this a disturbance? Because, imagine if you're living in an area and then all of a sudden a whole bunch of other things come live in that area and start out-competing you for space. That's going to affect you. That's going to affect your environment, and it's going to affect your ability to survive. Now, some abiotic changes out there are things like tsunamis or pollution events that take place. If you look at the Exxon Valdez, which is the one that's semi-described here, that affected Prince William Sound. 11 million gallons of crude oil was spilt out. And, this is a physical change because it's a pollutant that's affecting the water column. It's one of the largest ecological disasters to happen in this country, next to the Broadwater oil spill that happened in the Gulf of Mexico just a few years ago. So another example of abiotic changes are storms and waves. Now, we're all familiar with waves and what they look like. And I think in the last lecture on beaches, you heard me say many times over that there aren't many waves in Long Island Sound because of fetch, because of lack of wind. But waves touch the bottom as they get closer to shore. And if there's a storm coming, those waves can break up long onto shore. So as waves enter the shallow water, their height increases, their length decreases, and you get these building waves that can then crash down. I showed you that picture during the flow lecture where it was a tsunami and people were getting pretty pummeled by that tsunami. But how actually do waves damage the shore? Well, they do that in 5 different mechanisms. The first one that they can do is they cause shoreline erosion, which means any shore that might be present, if it gets hit by a standing wave, some of that's going to get pulled off and pulled back. And there's plenty of examples throughout New England of homes that are very close to just teetering into falling down cliff faces that are made of sand that might not go far. They might go down 5 feet or 10 feet, but still that's structural damage, etc. There's sand blasting. So as those waves come and create the erosion on the shore, that erosion is a lot of dirt and a lot of sand, and that just gets ripped up into the water column and literally can sand blast rocks and rocky intertidal areas, subtidal rocky substrates that contain a lot of organisms. Also, in the shallow habitats, boulders can get overturned very easily. And I mentioned that when we did the flow lecture as well. Is if you go to a cobbly beach in a wavy habitat and you just close your eyes and listen, you can hear the boulders tumbling. And then there's shearing factors too, where large boulders can actually get moved and not just turned, but they can get shorn around the bottom where they just move along the substrate and cause damage. And then you have that sand that's redeposited into deeper areas from the coast can literally, drown organisms in sand, cover them up and bury them. So you have these 5 ways on how waves can damage rocky shores. And obviously another big example would be hurricanes. And we're fairly familiar with hurricanes around here. Just from having Irene and Sandy in 2011, 2012. We can't ever really teach about a disturbance without talking about Hurricane Katrina, which was a Category 5/6 storm that hit, New Orleans pretty much straight on. And if you look at the smaller pictures on the left there, you can see the amount of water that was brought into the habitat. So you can see all the standing water that's in blue where it used to be green. And that's just flooded. Those habitats are entirely flooded, and a lot of those habitats have never recovered. The Army Corps of Engineers is great at keeping water out of New Orleans just because of a series of pumps, etc. However, they aren't very good at maintaining those. So when things do flood, it usually takes a long time for them to clear out. Now, I know I mentioned a few lectures back that Morris Cove, that Lighthouse Point Park area, is kind of like a large bowl. The roads are in the high parts of the bowl, so if water ever gets into the lower parts of the bowl, if there's ever a hurricane that really hit that hard, chances are it's going to take a really long time for that habitat to dry out. And you can just see the size of the storm there in comparison to the state of Florida. I mean, it's immense. Now, if we look at hurricane tracks, this is available via NOAA, you can see a lot of the different tracks that hurricanes take. Each of those lines represent a different hurricane track, and that's pretty obvious. This was an easier year for us. We didn't really get hit too hard by any kind of storms. And if we look at 2007, you can see there's less storms. So you have this temporal variation in the amount and number of hurricanes that take place. So you can never really predict, how many are going to get into a particular habitat or affect you locally. Here's the 2011 storm track. I put this in because there's a storm there named Sean. I thought that was pretty funny. It's a little messed up. But this was the storm Irene that played total havoc on Connecticut. And if you follow that red line for Irene all the way up the Connecticut River Basin, all the way through Canada, there were parts of Vermont that suffered absolutely devastating flooding for weeks after this storm event took place. And we all know what happened to the, coast of Connecticut during Irene. That was a fairly glancing blow that had some major effects. It took, I know in my hometown, 10 days to get the power back on. Now if we go to the next big storm event, Sandy is there, and it's that red one that's got the number 31 on it that kind of goes directly into New Jersey. Again, we were highly affected by Sandy. It kind of spread itself out right there over New York and New Jersey for several hours, just wreaking all kinds of havoc. What that did was it created enough wind pressure to actually build up enough waves to come across Long Island Sound and affect the coast of Connecticut. A little less in the eastern part of Connecticut, but much more so toward New York City and in the western part. I would say western part from East Haven on west to New York. Obviously, 2012, very busy year for hurricanes. You can see that just with the number that are present. So 19 named storms. I think this year they've predicted 16 storms. Now, those abiotic changes are not just hurricanes, but it's any kind of flow. So when you have, substrate that separates and it moves down a gradient, that's a flow as well. That's a landslide. You can have toppling landslide, slumping landslides. And those slump landslides are kind of like the coastal erosions that take place along marine habitats. You can have creeping landslides where slowly the road will get covered up, but it takes a little while, and you usually can remediate that for several years. And then you have the falls, which might be the least common of these, where cliff just erodes and falls into the water. Now, landslides can also be caused by tsunamis, can also be caused by volcanoes that can cause lava flows. So you have the original summit of the volcano can blast off the top of a mountain, causing all that landslide to take place. When that volcano collapses, you have that, magma body that is released, and you can have magma flows that flow directly into the water. All that lateral blast is in that picture is the dust and the sediment that's going to be probably deposited on nearby lands and forests or marine habitats. That fast-moving debris can avalanche directly into the sea, forming a tsunami. That can then cause a wave to travel to some distant coastline, building up as it goes. And tsunamis have besides the Thailand example that's so well documented, tsunamis hit the coast several times a year. Most of them don't get named. They don't have characteristics associated with them that somebody could pinpoint, but there are some famous tsunamis that have taken place out there. Now, lava flow, when that actually happens, this is a picture from Hawaii. The lava is flowing directly into the ocean there, and you can see where it's still on fire. There's remnants of heat there. There's a lot of heat there. You're not going to want to walk through that because you'd catch on fire right away. But when lava flows, it meets the sea. And when it meets the sea, it cools down. And when it cools down, it becomes harder and basically is new substrate. So when it meets the sea, it releases all the heat because the steam is coming off. And you have new coastline that is essentially produced because of this. So if you look at this flow from an active volcano on Hawaii right now, you can see where the old coastline was. You can see that a road has been completely destroyed by the lava flow. And you can see where the new coastline is. That's that shaded hatched area. That's called the lava delta. And that looks just like, the first part of this slide, where it's all just black and getting harder and cooling off, and it becomes new coast. Then you have the lava tube that is still flowing to the lava bench. And the lava bench is essentially pushing out into the water column, creating more new coastline. That's not a bad thing, because when you have new coastline, you give opportunities for organisms to come settle on that coastline and to change the ecology of that coastline to find their niche and to survive. Now, another type of abiotic change is coral bleaching. We know with climate change taking place, a lot of corals around the planet, which tend to be fragile organisms, bleach. And by bleaching, what that means is that corals lose their unicellular dinoflagellates that live within their tissue. We talked about dinoflagellates when we talked about the phytoplankton lecture, and I gave you specifically this example that corals have living in them zooxanthellae. That zooxanthellae live in the ectodermal tissue of the coral, providing that coral its color, but also providing the coral all kinds of the benefits associated with photosynthesis. Oxygen. The zooxanthellae get a place to live, and they get glycerol, which is an animal byproduct that they use for their own reproduction. So with climate change, what we have found many times over, that the oceans are slowly starting to warm up. And we know that ocean warming or water warming is one trigger that can lead to coral bleaching. The impact of this change increases the mortality of this very important species on a coral reef. We're going to talk in the next bit of lectures about corals and their importance, so that will be included on your final exam. But this stuff is fair game for exam number 2. So the results of disturbances are that there is biological diversity is dependent on natural disturbance. There is success of a wide range of species dependent on disturbances taking place. So up till now, we've talked about disturbances that have been negative. Sometimes disturbances aren't negative when it comes to a species ecology. Sometimes disturbances are required. And that's because of this concept called ecological succession. Now, succession takes place when an environment has been maintained in a stable state for a relatively long period of time. Each of the organisms that are present thrive. They're adapted to their environment, so they really enjoy where they are. And what happens is the environment becomes somewhat stale. So there's no new organisms allowed to settle in there because all these other organisms are living a good life. Things are good. They're resisting change. So having a disturbance every once in a while helps to break up the monotony of those kind of stale habitats by allowing for new areas to be opened up for organisms to come in and settle. So if conditions change, the existing species are replaced by new species that come in that may be better adapted to their particular habitat. Now, a lot of times what this can lead to is the steamroller effect, with better adapted organisms coming in each step to take advantage of any nutrients or niches that are available. And so it's the organisms that have moderate disturbances associated with them that have the greatest biodiversity and are actually the healthiest habitats. Now, this is known as the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This was first proposed by J. Philip Grime in 1973, but proposed again by Joseph Connell in 1978. I'm going to ask this question on the test. You should really know what the intermediate disturbance hypothesis says and who developed it. It's an ecological hypothesis that proposes that the biodiversity is going to be highest when disturbance is neither too rare or too frequent. So if you look at this graph and you look at the level of diversity along the y-axis, you can see that it's highest right under Connell's name, going all the way down to intermediate levels of disturbance. When it's rarely disturbed, you end up with those stale kind of environments that don't really change much. If it's frequently disturbed, you don't really have a chance to set up a community. Maybe one or two ratty or selected species will come in and settle, but other than that, no. Things don't get an opportunity to really settle and grow. So when you have a moderately disturbed habitat, one that suffers a disturbance every so often, but maybe not every year, you have a lot more biodiversity associated with that. That is excellent for marine habitats. And this intermediate disturbance hypothesis has been demonstrated to be true again and again and again and again in the literature. So let's talk about one particular catastrophic hurricane that had a massive impact on Jamaican coral reefs. It was called Hurricane Allen. It hit Jamaica in 1980. It was Category 5 on 3 separate occasions when it was hitting. The wind speeds reached 190 miles per hour. It's one of the most intense storms ever in the month of August, and it spent nearly 3 days as a Category 5 storm. That's huge, folks. Okay, that's 3 days of Hurricane Katrina. And so let's think about a coral reef and what happens on coral reefs. So the impact really affected the north coast of Jamaica, specifically the Discovery Bay area. Now, I lived in Jamaica for a year at one point, for 6 months at another point, and another 3 months at another point. I love Jamaica. I wish that I could bring my family there, move there, and live there. That's how much I am in love with that country. But on the northern coast of Jamaica, there's Discovery Bay Marine Laboratory run by the University of West Indies. It's been there since 1965. It's one of the most frequented coral reef areas on the planet. So it hosts a lot of coral reef biologists and ecologists. So there were studies and there were scientists there as the storm was hitting who had done pre-hurricane assessments and post-hurricane assessments, which is unbelievable to have that many people involved in these processes. But if you look at the damage to the different organisms that were present and you look at the before and after, with the percent dead, you can see how drastically changed those numbers are. From the percent injured to the standing crop to the percent cover of different organisms. And you can see the overall effect that has taken place because of this hurricane. So a lot of different organisms were impacted. Probably one of the largest and most negative impacts was on an urchin called Diadema antillarum, and different types of fish. Now those fish and urchins are known to be herbivores, which means they eat macroalgae that grow on reefs. If the urchins and the fish go away, which has happened because of the storm, macroalgae get a hold on coral reefs and there's nothing to keep it in check, so it grows wildly. And this has changed the Discovery Bay coral reef communities dramatically. The urchin communities are still reduced to this day. And we're looking at, 36 years? 36 years since this storm hit. And we're looking at urchin populations that went from 100 per 2 meters squared to 1 per 18 meters squared. So the urchins really suffered, hence the algae have taken over. Of the corals that were present, around 254 fragments of Acropora cervicornis, which is that pencil-looking like coral there in that picture, were tagged within 9 days after the hurricane. Only 4 were living 5 months later. So 5 living out of 254. So even though corals can fragment, re-cement themselves to the reef and grow, the habitat had been so disturbed that those corals didn't get a chance to do that. So that's just one example of a major impact that that disturbances have on reefs. Of 54 fragments of this beautiful coral called Acropora palmata, look at that. I mean, that's just gorgeous. You never see Acropora palmata like that anymore. 4 weeks after the hurricane, only 28% were alive. and then only 28% were alive at 16 weeks after the storm. So you can see that, the Phragmites suffered, a lot as well. They don't get a chance to cement themselves to the substrate. Plus, the amount of sediment that must have been down there just whipping around probably caused all kinds of sand blasting. So there are many detached sponges. Many ropey sponges couldn't reattach. But reefs have a way of re-cementing and finding their balance. And even though the hurricane happened, what it did was it scoured away so much habitat that all you had left was large amounts of bare substrate. And that large amount of bare substrate was perfect for all types of organisms to eventually come and settle again in those habitats. So even though that hurricane had a massive effect, it created patterns of distribution that were incredibly different from when prior to the hurricane happening. So keep this in mind. Disturbance sounds like a bad word, but if you don't have it, life gets stale. And if life gets stale from marine communities, the biodiversity decreases and it gets more and more unhealthy. The last thing you want to have in a marine environment is an unhealthy habitat. Now, these are just some of the references associated with today's lecture. Look at the number of authors for the Hurricane Allen's impact on Jamaican coral reefs. That's how many people were there when the hurricane hit. Those are some of the biggest names in coral reef biology, which is just incredible. We'll talk more about corals next time.